Welcome to the FormFox lab-based urine collection user training module. This training is designed to help users understand the basics of using FormFox for a federally regulated urine collection with the FormFox system and assumes that the user has completed a DOT-certified collector training course. For this example, we will assume that the donor does not have a pre-ordered test. For this instance, you will tap on the purple-colored link, Account Number. After tapping the account number link, you will see a menu of laboratories. Account-specific information can vary from lab to lab. Therefore, you must select the lab which will be processing the specimen in order to generate the right CCF. For our first example, we will choose CRL. For collections that will be sent to CRL, you will be asked to choose a procedure. Tap on the radio button next to Regulated DOT Drug Test. Once all the fields are entered, tap Search. At this point, FormFox will check the database for any existing pre-ordered tests that match this donor's information and laboratory account number. If there is a pre-ordered test, it will appear. If no pre-ordered test exists, a message in red appears indicating such and instructs the collector to create a new test. Select Create New Test. The next screen is the collection instructions. They will appear on the screen for 5 seconds before allowing the collector to move on to the donor information page. If the donor would like to view a simplified version of the instructions, the collector can tap the link that reads View Help. There is a Close button that appears at the bottom of the screen. Tap this button to close the simplified instructions. Tapping Close brings you back to the detailed instructions page. You need to scroll to the bottom of the page. You have the option of tapping on a box. If the donor would like a copy of the collection instructions, selecting Continue Collection will bring you to the donor information page. On the next screen, verify the donor information, filling out all the required fields denoted with a red asterisk. Since this is a federal collection, there is a button to reopen the instructions page should you need to reference those instructions. If the donor refuses to provide their ID number, check the box indicating the refusal. If the donor cannot provide a phone number for either the evening phone or daytime phone, enter NP. The donor's identification must be verified by either photo ID or an employer representative. Select the button that corresponds to the method used. If an employer representative is used to identify the donor, enter the name of the employer representative. Select the reason for test. Please note that if the collector selects Return to Duty or Follow Up, in accordance with regulations, the software will remind you that these collections must be observed collections. For this example, we will choose Pre-employment. Next, select the testing authority using the drop-down menu. In general, laboratory accounts are only linked to one federal drug test panel, which FormFox will automatically display in the Drug Test to be Performed section. In the event that a laboratory has more than one federal drug test panel, the collector will be required to select the appropriate panel. The next screen is Collection Step 2. It will walk you through the collection process. You will be presented with a series of yes/no questions that guide you through the correct collection process based on given responses. The first question asks if an item has been brought to the facility with the intent to adulterate or substitute the specimen. If the answer is yes, a message will appear directing the collector to ask the donor to consent to a direct observed collection. If the answer is no, proceed with the collection process according to the federal collector training guidelines. Once the donor has provided a specimen, you will be able to select the Yes radio button after the question, was the donor able to provide a specimen? However, if the donor was unable to void, select No. If you select No, a button will appear that reads, Unable to void, donor refused. After tapping on the button, you will be asked to select the appropriate status of the test, provide required remarks, and hit the Next button. If the collector needs to contact the designated employer representative, the DER, the contact information appears on this screen. Choosing to suspend the test indicates that the donor will reattempt to provide a sample at a later time. Choosing any of the other options will end the collection. Remarks will always be required. Once these steps have been completed, tap Next. If the test has been suspended, the donor will have up to 3 hours to provide a sufficient sample. When the donor is able to reattempt, return to the Open Collections tab on the FormFox homepage and select the donor's name in order to reopen the test. At this point, you will be asked to re-enter the donor's last name and check the box indicating re-verification of the donor's identity. The collection wizard will reopen to the collection instructions. Tapping Continue on the collection instructions page will take you back to step 1, and you will need to re-verify the donor's information and then tap Next. As before, in collection step 2, the collector will be asked the same questions as before regarding whether or not the donor has brought in any items to adulterate or substitute the specimen. The collector will then be asked a series of questions regarding the specimen. Once the donor is able to provide a specimen, the collector must determine whether the temperature of the specimen is between 90 and 100 degrees. If the answer is no, a button reading temperature out of range will appear. Tap on this button. The new screen will have a message which reads, "You must complete this collection and immediately conduct a new collection under Direct Observation Procedures. Please enter the appropriate remarks below. After you collect a second specimen, please notify your supervisor and the DER that you have collected a specimen under direct observation and the reason for doing so. If the DER is unavailable, specify the DER name, date, and time that you attempted to contact them in the remarks section and complete the collection." Tap the next button. If the temperature is in range, the collector will be asked whether or not the specimen appears to be tampered with. If the answer is yes, read the pop-up message on the screen. Inform the donor that a second collection under direct observation will be conducted and tap yes on the message box to proceed. If the donor refuses to consent to a second collection under direct observation, tap no on the donor consent message box. This collection will be considered a refusal to test. You are instructed to notify the DER and enter remarks supporting the events that took place. Tapping the next button will end the collection. If the specimen does not appear to be tampered with, tap no and proceed. The last question in collection step 2 is there a minimum of 45 milliliters of urine? If the answer is no, tap on the button that reads insufficient quantity, shy bladder. On the next screen, select the status of the collection from the drop-down menu. Enter remarks and select Next. Depending on the status selected, the test will either be suspended or the collection process will end. If the test has been suspended, the donor will have up to 3 hours to provide a sufficient sample. When the donor is able to reattempt, return to the Open Collections tab on the FormFox homepage and select the donor's name in order to reopen the test. At this point, you will be asked to re-enter the donor's last name and check the box indicating re-verification of the donor's identity. Next, the wizard will reopen to the collection instructions to begin the collection process. Tapping Continue will take the collector to step 1, where all of the previously entered information will appear. Re-verify information and proceed to step 2 by tapping the Next button. As before, in collection step 2, the collector will be asked the same series of questions beginning with whether or not the donor has brought in any items to adulterate or substitute the specimen. Once the donor is able to provide a sufficient specimen quantity that is within the appropriate temperature range that has not been tampered with, the collector will proceed to the next section on the page. The split sample designation will be the default in the software. If you are collecting for a federal agency that does not require a split sample collection, and therefore a single sample is collected, change the designation to single. Enter any appropriate remarks in the remarks section. If remarks were entered previously as a result of using one of the alternate path wizards, those remarks will also be included in the remarks section of the CCF. At this stage in the collection process, the collector is instructed to pour the sample from the collection container into the sample vials and seal the vials with the green Federal FormFox seals. The collector should then date the seals and request that the donor initial the seals on both vials. Once this step is completed, select the radio button indicating such. If the donor refuses to initial the labels, hit the button next to the donor refuses to initial. If the donor refuses to initial, FormFox will autofill the remarks section with the note, "Donor refuses to initial vials." Tap the next button. On the next page, the collector will be asked to scan or enter the barcode from each specimen bottle. Have the donor verify all the information on the screen, paying close attention to the specimen ID values entered or scanned into the specimen ID fields to ensure a match with the specimen IDs on the sample vials. If the donor would like to review the instructions and Privacy Act statement, there is a link to that information on this screen. The next step is to tap the donor certification and signature button. When the donor is asked to provide a signature, that signature can be captured on the iPad. If the donor provides an electronic signature, simply tap the Accept Signature button. If the donor refuses to provide an electronic signature, but will provide a wet signature with a pen, the donor can choose to do so at this point by tapping the Accept button under the phrase, "I refuse to sign electronically and will sign copies 2 through 5 of the custody and control form directly with a pen." This will require the collector to print out copies 2 through 5 of the CCF. If the donor refuses to provide a signature altogether, the donor may tap the Accept button below the phrase, "I refuse to provide my signature." If the donor chooses this option, a remark will appear on the CCF indicating that the donor refused to sign. Once the donor's signature and certification process is complete, tap the next button. On the Collection Step 4 page, the collector will select the courier that will transport the specimen to the laboratory. Next, the collector will certify the collection with their signature by tapping on the collector's signature button, signing the iPad, and selecting the Accept Signature button. In the next section of the Collection Step 4 page, the collector will indicate which copies of the CCF to print. The laboratory copy 1 is required to be printed and is pre-selected for the collector. This copy will be included in the transportation bag with the sample and sent to the laboratory. Collectors can choose to print additional copies of the CCF by tapping the checkbox next to each of the desired copies. The MRO copy 2 will be auto-faxed to the MRO if the collection site has subscribed to that service. Otherwise, the collector must print copy 2 and manually distribute to the MRO. The donor is required to receive a copy of the CCF. The donor can choose to have their copy printed or have a link to the document sent via email or text message. Should the donor request a copy of the collection instructions and Privacy Act statement, the collector has an option to choose to print those at this time. Tapping Print and Submit will immediately send the lab copy to the printer. If the collector elected to print additional copies of the CCF, those copies will appear in a print preview window and require the collector action to enable printing. Please make sure that the copies print legibly before closing out of the preview window. Tapping the Next button will bring you to the final steps of the collection process. On the Collection Step 5 page, FormFox will instruct the collector to package the lab copy and the specimen into the shipping container. The collector should then check the box, certifying that all steps for this collection have been completed. The final step is to tap the Finish button. This concludes the training module. Thank you for your attention.